Hello and welcome, I'm Sammy K. Powers, and in this video we're going to create our very first PHP test. Yay! In the previous videos we compiled PHP from source, and we learned how to run the tests with runtest.php or make tests, which is still going to run test.php. And in this video, let's go ahead and make a test. So I'm going to create a new test here, echo_basic.phpt. And I'm putting this right in the root of the PHP source directory. You wouldn't typically do this for tests, but for this example, we're just going to keep it in php-source. This is a brand new file, so I'm going to create a section called test. And this is the name of the test. So we are testing, well, I will just say echo basic functionality. Now we're going to do a section called file, which is the PHP code that we want to actually test. So we'll open up our PHP tag and close it and put in some PHP. So we're going to do echo and say hello. And then we're going to add a space and then a comma, not a dot, which would concatenate a string. We're going to add a comma to send an argument. Hello, I take args. So I didn't know if you knew this about echo, but it takes a list of arguments. If you didn't know that, you do now. And we're going to test that functionality here. So hopefully what we can expect in this next section, is the output of the script to say hello space I take args. Now, we could add a new line if we wanted to, but we don't. It's not required. By default, run test will actually strip out new lines. So if we ended up adding a new line here, for example, like maybe I did like something like that, or if I added in some new lines at the end of this, say like I concatenate a string. So we use arguments and concatenation and single quotes and double quotes, do stuff like that. None of that's going to matter because run test strips out new lines. But I'm just going to take this out just for kicks and giggles. We could run that with our handy compiled binary that we made under the SAPI CLI PHP. We could just run echo basic just to see that it runs as a normal PHP file. And as we might expect, the new line, we didn't add a new line here, so the expect section is running up against the file section. So let's go ahead and use make test to run this test. So we're going to specify specifically that we want to run this test by setting the tests variable, and we're going to set it to echo_basic.phpt. Press enter, and with our fingers crossed, and it was the fingers crossed that made it pass, but we can see that the test pass with, it's called echo basic functionality. That's the text that we wrote at the top under the test section. And as you can see, it's just got the name of the file here, and then we have the output that shows that it passed, which is great. If we were to change something in our file, so I'm going to use the up arrow key, just a VI, open this up in Vim again. Hello, and I take args, and then maybe say, for example, I add a happy face at the end, a smiley emoticon, and then I try to run it again. I use the up arrow keys to pull this back up, and as you can see, we get different output because our test has failed, and we have a failed test summary that will show all the failed tests. If we scroll up, we can see that we have one test failed, nothing passed, sad face. And in fact, if I were to list our files, I'm going to do ls-al, but I'm also going to grep for our test name. So it was like echo something, I don't know. As you can see, we have a lot more files here that didn't exist before. Before we just had our phpt file, but now we have like all these different types of files. We're going to go over that in a different video. But for now, let's go open up our echo basic again, phpt, and fix this because this is not good. Let's run the test again, and it passes. Yay. Now, I guess I should mention that if I were to grep for the echo file again, run test automatically deleted all those other files there, and we're going to get into all that stuff later. Now, one other thing I want to mention, if I go back into our phpt file, you might be familiar with some standards that say you don't need a closing PHP tag in your PHP file. And that's kind of actually handy in real world applications because sometimes you have an extra trailing new line at the end of your closing tag, and you don't necessarily want that to happen. So believe it or not, if I were to remove the closing PHP tag on this and run it through run tests again, you can see that it passes just fine. But this is not recommended, because even though run tests will accept it just fine, if I try to run this test file as a normal PHP file, you get a parse error, syntax error, because this isn't a valid PHP file anymore. Even though run tests will accept it just fine, because what happens with run tests is it'll open this file, look at each one of these section tags, and basically execute each one of these things independently. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to run the test section, it just kind of pulls that in as text. When it gets to the file section, it's like, oh, this I need to execute this. So it's going to pull these two lines in right here and run it as an independent script. So even though it doesn't have the closing PHP tag, it'll still run just fine. It doesn't run into this next section when it runs through the tests, through run tests. So let's go ahead and add that back, because that's the best practice to close all of our PHP tags. Now we can just run it as a plain old PHP file without getting any errors. Yay, and we can also run it through run tests without getting any errors either. So now that we can write a basic test, let's actually test for something like an error case, because I want to show you something that's interesting about the expect section. So let's pop over into the PHP documentation about this function called fileMTime. As you can see, it gets the file modification time of a file. What if we wanted to test the functionality of this such that if we didn't pass it any arguments, that we would expect to see some sort of error warning or something like that, right? So let's make a test for this error case. So I'm going to pop back over into the command line and say vi file mtime underscore error.phpt, because we're testing the error case. We just do dash test file mtime. This is the name of the function. Test error case. Let's create a PHP that will test this error. So what we'll do is we will echo file mtime, and we won't pass it any arguments. Now what we expect to see is some kind of error. So we don't know exactly what the error is. So I got an idea. Why don't we just run this as a PHP script without running it through run tests and copy and paste whatever it outputs as our expect section. So let's write and save that. Let's run it through our compiled binary. So file mtime error phpt. All right, here we go. Run it. Here we go. A warning. That's what we're looking for. Great. We'll just copy paste that. No big deal. Copy. Let's go back into our test, and in the expect section, let's just delete this and paste in. So there we go. Warning. File name expects exactly one parameter, 0 given in the name of the file on line 5. Cool. What else? So right quick, and let's run this through run tests. So we're going to do make tests equals, and we're just going to run the one. So we're going to say file mtime underscore error. We run it and it failed. Crap. What happened? So let's list the files and grep for file mtime. Okay, so we're going to go into more details about what each one of these things is, but let's look at file mtime underscore error dot out. This is going to be the exact output that run test saw when we ran the file. So let's go ahead and open that up. So I'll just use less to open that. File mtime error dot out. Okay, what did it say? Oh, it's saying it's on line 2. So we got this, it's almost exactly, but we just got the wrong line. When we ran it the first time, it says it was on line 5. This is saying it's on line 2. So let's go back and edit our file. Scroll back up to that one. Perfect. Yeah, so if I count 0, or I'm a programmer, I start with 0. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, if we run this as a PHP file, it's on the 5th line. But since I mentioned earlier that run test will actually split these sections up and run them independently. It's actually starting here. So it's actually on line 1, 2. So let's go to the end of this thing and change that to 2 and see if we can get the test to pass. Go ahead and scroll back up to run the test with make test, and it's still broken. So what did we miss? We missed something else. Well, let's take a look at the output again, because I think we missed something. File merror.out. Let's see. Take a look here. Ah, I see it. There it is, right there. The file name is .php instead of phpt. When we ran it from the command line, it was showing that we needed a phpt file. All right, we can change that. File name error.phpt. Let's fix that. We'll come down here and change this line here to just .php. Write that and quit. And let's run it from run tests. And as you can see, the test passes exactly, which is great. But that was kind of annoying to have to go back and be like, we have to tweak it so it's in this right environment. But I want to actually run another thing by you. What if we're in an environment or running this on a different computer and the PHP source file is not located in user/source? That's just where we put ours, but what if it's in somewhere else? And also, keeping track of lines is really annoying, because what if I wanted to like come up here and be like, add a comment? Suddenly, this is line 3, so I've got to come down here and then like append, like I gotta add 3. That's really annoying. So luckily, there's a special section called expect_f. And this allows you to add substitutions in your expect statement, like what the output will be. So if we come back here, if I change 3 to %d to indicate that I want a number, and I can also take this file name and change that to %s to say I want a string. So change word %s. So now I have a substitution string that's got all the components that I would expect, except for those little independent things that either are hard to kind of keep track of on the test. If the line number is really not important, we don't need to care about it. And also the different platforms. So let's write and quit and run the test again from make test and see what happens. And as you can see, we get our test passing again. So expect_f is a really important section to remember, especially when testing like error cases, when the output is going to be kind of environment specific. Now I named my first test echo_basic, and I named the second one file mtime_error. There's a reason why I named them those things. In fact, there is a special web page dedicated to writing tests in PHP. It's qa.php.net/write-test.php. If you go there, you'll see there's a section called naming conventions, and it describes the way that you should name your test files. So let's make another test file. This time let's test a function curl_init, which is part of the curl extension. And we can see that it initializes a curl session and it returns a resource. So why don't we run or create a test and test that it's actually returning a resource like we would expect. So let's pop over here. So following our naming schema, we will call this curl_init_basic.phpt. So since we're testing the basic functionality of the curl init, and our test is going to be curl_init creates a resource. And I typically add a dash here. It's not really clear, the naming schema here. But our file, which is our PHP, is going to be all the code that we want to test. So what are we going to test? We're going to set up a curl handler here. Curl init. And hopefully that will be returning a resource. So what we're going to do is use var_dump. var_dump all the things. var_dump is fantastic because not only does it show the variable's contents, but it also shows the type of variable. So we're going to check if this is a resource by using the isResource function and send it ch. Now this will return true if ch is in fact a resource. It's a type resource. And just so that we're making sure to clean things up here, curl close, and we'll send it in our resource, just to not leave any dangling bits here. So our expect section should be the output of var_dump, which will hopefully be a Boolean true. So bool true is what we would expect to see. let's write and close. So let's run our new test with make test tests variable and specify the curl test we just created, and it should pass with flying colors, but it fails. Ooh, this isn't good. Well, as we saw in our previous test, we can look at a specific file called .out. So the name of our test file .out, and see what does run test see? Fatal error, uncaught error, call to undefined function, curl init. What? But it exists. Curl, the extension, wasn't compiled with our version of PHP. Oh, so this is problematic. We need a new section to help us out here. There's actually a specific section that we can use here. If I open up curl basic.phpt, it's called the skip if section. Now skip if is spelled skip if. Skip if is just a bit of PHP code that we can have run tests execute to determine whether or not this test should be run. Now, most tests will keep all this PHP on one line. It's kind of ugly, but it kind of keeps the skip if section taking up as little space as possible. So we're just going to do a quick check here. If I can spell, if not extension loaded, and the extension we're looking for is curl. That's the name of the extension. Then we're not even going to use curly brackets or anything. We can just put it all on one line. Die. And then we're going to put some kind of message here. Skip ext/curl required. All right, let's give this a shot. Let's run it through run tests again. And it shows that one test was skipped, which is fantastic because we don't have curl installed, so we can't test curl init. Now, one really important thing I want to mention about skip if is that if I don't include the word skip in the actual output, it's not going to skip the test. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So if I actually just run this as a normal PHP file, just so we can kind of see the exact output that's being done here, curl init phpt. This runs as a plain old PHP file, and it's running up against my command line, but that's okay. You can see skip if actually outputs skip ext/curl required. But if I scroll up from our output, from our test skipped, it shows the reason why it was skipped, and it just shows ext/curl required. It doesn't have the word skip there. Now that's important. If I were to open this up in Vim again, and I were to go down here and remove the word skip, and just like kill it, just die, write and quit. If I run this as a PHP file again, as you can see, I don't have curl installed, so it quits, right, as we would expect. But what happens if we run this through run tests? And this is getting ugly, so let me pop this out again. All right, we're going to make test, specify the curl init basic. But look, it says failed test summary. Even though we have a skip if section that dies, it exits, it stops the execution of the program. But run test doesn't care. It's looking for this skip word. It's very important. As mentioned before several times, run test will break up each one of these sections and deal with them independently. It's also taking this skip if section and running as its own little PHP script, so to speak. So it doesn't matter that we told it to die. The script will eventually just die anyway. It's going to kill the execution of the script independently, whether we say die or not. In fact, we could just do this. We could do echo skip ext/curl required. So I'm not even killing the script, and I'm just saying skip it. And if I run the test through make test again, it skips the test perfectly, even though I didn't halt the execution of the script. Now, this is problematic for running it as a PHP, just plain old PHP file, because although we see the message here, like, you know, ext/curl is required, it still continues to execute the script as if nothing was wrong. So that's why it's sort of a best practice to kill your script if this indeed is an issue. To die. Oh, I pressed the wrong button. My Vim key bindings that I have in PHP Storm are slightly different than the real ones. So make sure that if you're using the skip if section, you include the word skip in the actual output, and then give a little bit of a reason why the test was skipped. Now, in order to get this test to pass, I would actually have to compile PHP again with curl enabled. Now, I could just do that by running configure again and trying to remember all those enable blah, 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 blah. But instead, there is this kind of neat little file that gets created when you run configure. If I take a look at config.nice, config.nice remembers the last thing that you used to configure before you ran make. And as you can see, it's got the flags that we enabled, the enable maintainers thread safety, enable debug, and enable the CLI SAPI. Now, the very last line there, it's got this $@ @. So that means I could run config.nice and send it another flag like with curl, for example, which will install curl, the curl extension, and it'll run config with all the previous flags in addition to this new one with curl. I'm not going to do that right now because you can do that on your own time to install your own extensions. But I want to show you a couple more sections that you might be interested in. So if this is your first contribution to PHP, you might want to, tell the world about it. So there is a special credits section that you can use to say, hey, this was me, and leave your mark on PHP source. And I will leave my mark. You just put your name, your email, and then it's also kind of cool to leave a little bit of a credit of like how you got involved with PHP internals. So you're part of TestFest 2017, and you're in the Chicago PHP user group, and you put down the date. I don't even know what the date is today. Oh, it's definitely not September though. And there you go. Now your name exists eternally in PHP source code. There's also another test section called description. And this can be used if you have to say a little bit more about your test. So if you needed to be more verbose, lots more info here. So you might be wondering, are there other sections? And the answer is yes, there are. In fact, if you go over to qa.php.net/phpt_details.php, there is the reference for all of the section names. And there's quite a few of them, as you can see. We've already gone over tests and description and credits. We just did those. And skip if. There's also file, which we've gone over, which is your PHP, and expect and expectf. But there's also expect regex, expect external, expectf external. There's all different types of things here. There's a handy one here called any, which allows you to specify any settings, and you just put each setting on its own line. I'm going to scroll up, sorry for the scrolly. There's also something like standard in, which allows you to specify a standard input if you're testing, for example, like readline, the readline extension, which just takes input from the command line. You would need some sort of input, and stdin is the section you would use to feed that input into your test. So I recommend just going ahead and scanning through all the sections to see what's available to you while you're writing tests. qa.php.net has some pretty good documentation. There's some further documentation on phpinternalsbook.com, which used to be all about PHP 5, but Julian Polly has been going through and adding tons of internals documentation on PHP 7. And I actually started a new little section here for testing PHP source. And there's some to-dos here, so if you're familiar with some of this stuff and want to contribute to the documentation, please go ahead and do so. But it's on GitHub. If I click down here at the bottom, you can see there's a repo for the PHP internals book. One last thing I want to mention in this video is that some of the tests are pretty complicated. In fact, the PDO tests are probably not a good place to start if you want to add more tests or figure out what's going on. I do want to show you, however, some of the tests actually have readmes. So if I were to actually look at the /tests/readme, you can see that the readme contains information about setting environment variables. So when these tests run, it looks for environment variables for the name of the database and the username and the password and all that stuff. There's quite a few tests that actually take advantage of environment variables, but you can find those in various readmes throughout. So make sure that before you start writing tests for an extension, see if there's a README and see if there's any specific environment variables that need to be set before you continue on with your tests. All right, that's about it for this video. We learned how to create PHP tests, which is great. We learned about various sections. We learned that some tests have a README, so we can figure out more about environment variables that might need to be set up before we run the tests. But we also saw that there were a number of files that got created when a test failed. And we only kind of looked at the .out, but we should probably look at these other files because they're pretty handy when it comes to debugging failed tests. So that's what we'll do in our next video.